At 72, diabetes had shadowed me for years, but one fateful day, it struck so hard that I spent over a month in the hospital. Lying there at my weakest, I expected protection, comfort, yet the most poisonous snake in my family finally revealed her true nature. My daughter-in-law ran rampant, brazenly giving me strange medicines and plotting to strip this frail old woman of all her wealth. But here's the question: how did I survive those sweet but deadly traps? How did I turn the game around when everyone thought I was finished? Stay with me until the very end of this video, subscribe, like, and share it. And don't forget to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. My dear friends, you won't want to miss what comes next. At 72, my life had finally settled into a rhythm that was neither extravagant nor lacking. Retirement had stripped away the rush of deadlines and business meetings, leaving me with the quiet comfort of routine. Each month I relied on my pension, a small but steady check that, combined with the rent from a modest house I owned, kept me afloat. I did not need much, just enough to pay the bills, buy my groceries, and keep a little aside for an occasional treat. There was peace in knowing my days no longer revolved around climbing ladders or meeting expectations. Neighbors often described me as reserved and composed, and perhaps they were right. I was never one to chatter loudly or involve myself in gossip. Instead, I found joy in small acts of order and dignity. I wore my hair neatly pulled back, kept my clothes pressed, and carried myself with a kind of pride that was not arrogance, but self-respect. When people greeted me at the mailbox or in the garden, they always remarked on how calm I seemed. That calmness was my shield, the thing that kept me whole when life's storms passed too close. Of course, I was not without passions. My greatest indulgence was collecting antique watches. Each piece I found carried a whisper of another time, another hand that once wound the gears. Some of them were scratched, some still gleamed, but to me they were treasures, a kind of memory bank I could hold in my palm. Friends would tease me, asking why I spent so carefully on everything else but saved room for these trinkets. I would simply smile and say that time was the most precious thing of all, and these watches reminded me that every moment counted. Still, behind the composed surface, my body was quietly waging a battle I could not ignore. Diabetes had been with me for years, a shadow that grew heavier with each season. I had managed it with discipline, measuring my meals, keeping my sugar under watch, but no discipline could fully tame it. Eventually, the weakness deepened, and one morning I found myself unable to rise from bed without dizziness clouding my vision. The doctor's words were gentle but firm. I had to be hospitalized. A month in a hospital bed can feel like an eternity. The sterile white walls, the rhythmic beeping of machines, the sharp smell of antiseptic became my daily companions. I tried to keep my spirits intact, reminding myself that I had lived through harder days. Yet lying there at my most vulnerable, I felt the fragility of age in a way I never had before. For the first time in many years, I wondered what storms might come next, and whether the calm life I had built could withstand them. Christopher, my only son, had always been a devoted child, but life had pulled him far from me. He was a construction engineer, tied up with a project in another state. His days were spent on scaffolds and blueprints, long hours under the sun, and the little time he had left was for hurried phone calls to check on me. He always asked if I was eating well, if the doctors were kind, if I was resting enough. I could hear the worry in his voice, yet the distance between us was like an invisible wall. No matter how much he wanted to be present, he simply could not see what was happening in our home. Laura, my daughter-in-law, was another story. Not once did she step foot into that hospital room. She told the neighbors she was too busy, or that she disliked the smell of disinfectant, as though illness were something contagious to dignity. Every excuse felt like another layer of frost between us. I lay there, week after week, and not a single familiar gesture of comfort came from her. No flowers, no warm blanket brought from home, not even a hurried visit to hold my hand for a moment. The absence weighed on me more than I wanted to admit. I tried to convince myself it was normal, that everyone had their own burdens, their own ways of coping. But in the stillness of those nights, When the machines hummed and the hallway lights cast their cold glow, I felt the sharp edge of loneliness. A mother should not have to feel like a stranger in her own family, yet that was exactly the ache pressing into me. I thought of Christopher often. I knew if he could, he would have rushed to my side, sat in that uncomfortable chair beside the bed, and fussed over me like he always had as a boy. But all he had were words carried through a phone line. Words could soothe for a while, but they could not fill the emptiness of a vacant chair, nor could they replace the tenderness of a hand on mine. With Laura, it was different. Her silence was not born of distance, but of choice. And each day she chose to stay away, the truth grew clearer. I was not part of her world, not part of her care, not even in her sense of duty. That realization, more than the illness itself, gnawed at me. I learned then that weakness does not only come from the body. It comes from seeing the ones you counted on turn their eyes away. And in that sterile hospital room, wrapped in thin sheets, I felt the piercing solitude of being alive yet unseen. While the days in the hospital felt endless, I often reached for the small comfort of my phone. It wasn't for messages or news, but for the little application connected to the security cameras I had installed at home. One camera was in the living room, another in the study. At first, I only checked them to reassure myself that everything was in order, that the silence of my empty house was intact. But what I saw unsettled me. More than once, I watched Laura enter my study. She moved with a strange purpose, not like someone tidying up or dusting. She pulled open drawers, rifling through papers, bending low as though searching for something hidden. Sometimes she stood before the small safe I kept tucked against the wall. I had never shown her the combination, yet I saw her handling it, testing the lock with impatient fingers. And on several occasions, she walked out with her handbag bulging slightly, her steps quick, her eyes darting as if afraid someone might see. At first, I tried to explain it away. Perhaps she was looking for important documents for Christopher, or maybe she was putting something away for safekeeping. But the unease would not leave me. The way she moved was not the way of someone doing a favor. It was the way of someone taking advantage of an empty house. When I was finally discharged and returned home, I could not resist checking my treasures. My collection of antique watches had always been carefully arranged, each one resting in its velvet-lined box. I knew every piece by heart, the weight of them, the gleam of the brass or the faded leather straps. And when I opened the cabinet, my heart dropped. Several watches were gone. The spaces where they had rested now looked like missing teeth in a once perfect smile. The truth struck me like cold water. Laura had already begun reaching her hands into what was not hers. She had taken pieces of my past, of my memories, as though they were nothing but currency. Yet I did not scream or confront her. Instead, I swallowed the anger that rose in my chest. I forced my face into calmness whenever she appeared. I nodded politely, spoke gently, as if I knew nothing. Inside, however, I was sharpening my silence into a weapon. Pretending ignorance gave me time. Let her think the old woman was weak, that her games went unnoticed. Every move she made was another stitch in the web she was weaving around herself. And I decided, quietly and firmly, that I would wait until the moment her greed revealed itself fully. Laura had always been polite enough on the surface, but I began to see her eyes linger on things that were never hers. She knew well that I owned two houses. One was the modest home where I lived, filled with quiet routines and the scent of old books. The other was a small property I rented out, its monthly income a steady cushion that allowed me to live without worry. These were not secrets. They were the fruit of my labor, the foundation I had built for myself so that in old age I would not have to rely on anyone. But it was not just the houses that drew her attention. She must have heard, perhaps from careless words Christopher once spoke, that I kept a savings account in my own name. It was not a fortune like in the magazines, but it was enough, more than enough to tempt greedy hands. Over the years, I had built that account quietly, dollar by dollar, until it grew into a sum that promised security. That money represented my independence, the assurance that even if the world turned cold, I would not be left helpless. When I remembered the times I saw her on the camera, rifling through my papers, tugging at drawers, staring at the safe with a glint in her eyes, it became clearer. Laura was not after a trinket, not even the watches she had already taken. She was mapping out something larger. Her behavior was too deliberate, too calculated. She was searching not for objects but for proof, deeds, account numbers, any thread she could tug until the fabric of my life unraveled into her hands. The realization settled into me like ice. What I had first thought was carelessness was in fact the beginning of a plan. Laura was patient. She smiled when others were looking, excused her absence with smooth words, all the while preparing herself to strike when my body grew too frail to resist. It was no longer about small thefts. It was about seizing everything that gave me stability. I lay awake many nights, staring at the hospital ceiling, thinking of the mask she wore at family dinners, the gentle tone she used on the phone with Christopher, the way she convinced him she was managing things well at home. Behind that mask, ambition sharpened like a blade. She was waiting, simply waiting, for the moment I stumbled, for the moment she could claim more than what she deserved. I knew then that silence would be my weapon. To confront her too soon would only drive her deeper into deception. Better to let her believe she was clever, better to let her reveal the full measure of her greed. I would wait, watch, and when the time came, I would not be the one left powerless. In the middle of my illness, when every day seemed to stretch endlessly under the fluorescent lights of the hospital, there was one source of light that kept me breathing easier. Natalie, my 12-year-old granddaughter, visited me often. She carried books tucked under her arm and would sit at my bedside, reading aloud in her soft, steady voice. Sometimes she stumbled over long words, and we laughed together, her laughter brightening the sterile room more than any medicine could. Unlike her mother, Natalie's affection was genuine. She reached for my hand often, her small fingers warm against mine, reminding me that love still lived in this family. I cherished those moments. When the machines beeped and the nurses moved briskly about, Natalie's presence made me forget my weakness. She was sensitive, perceptive far beyond her years, and I could tell she understood more than she ever said. There was a tenderness in the way she watched me, as if she sensed the storm building beneath the surface of our household. One night, after she finished a chapter and closed the book, she sat in silence for a while, chewing her lip. I asked if she was tired, but she only shook her head. Her eyes were uncertain, shifting to the window and back to me. Finally, in a whisper so fragile I almost thought I imagined it, she said, "Grandma, I saw Mom bring a man to the house. He wasn't Dad." The words pierced through me like a knife. My breath caught, and a chill spread across my skin despite the heavy blankets. For a moment I could not speak. Natalie's voice trembled, as if she feared she had done something wrong by telling me. She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously, waiting for my reaction. I gathered her close, pressing her head against my shoulder, though inside my mind was reeling. I had already suspected Laura of greed, of scheming to get her hands on what was not hers. But this was something darker. Infidelity was not just betrayal of marriage, it was a sign of something deeper, a thread tying her to a larger plan. Who was this man she brought home? What place did he hold in her growing ambitions? Natalie whispered again, her words muffled against my gown. "I don't like him. He looks at things in the house like he wants them." Her innocence made the confession even heavier. Out of the mouths of children came truths adults tried to bury. I stroked her hair, hiding the storm inside me. I could not let her see the fear, the anger, the sudden knowledge that our family was standing on a cliff edge. I only told her she had been very brave and that she should trust me to take care of things. But in that quiet night, I knew the truth. Laura was not only after wealth, she was already walking down a path of betrayal that could destroy us all. They spoke in hushed voices, or so I imagined when I listened to the faint echo of their calls through the corner of my mind. From the small details I had caught on camera and the times Christopher was away, I pieced together their conversations like a reluctant puzzle. Laura and a man named Mark, who worked as a real estate broker, were often on the phone late into the night. Their words were practical, stripped of sentiment, focused on a single thing: the house and the money inside the bank account that I had spent a lifetime building. At first, it sounded like talk of selling or finding a buyer. Later, the language hardened. Mark used terms that sounded official and careful. He spoke of transfer procedures and paperwork, and of how courts in America handle cases when an elderly person is deemed to have diminished capacity. He said that with the right documents and a signature, transactions could be made to look perfectly lawful. Laura listened and nodded in the footage I had seen, her face composed, the kind of calm that hides calculation. Then the plan emerged, and a cold fear settled in my chest. They proposed using a strong sedative to make me unsteady, to dull my mind enough that I might sign papers without full awareness. The idea was presented as efficient and safe, a clean way to obtain legal authority. They imagined me confused and compliant, a harmless obstacle easily overcome with a few pills slipped into tea or a meal. Mark explained that if they could show a legitimate signature on transfer documents and later point to medical notes that suggested I lacked capacity, the legal system would favor the paperwork. It was a scheme dressed in legal language and cynical logic. I remember feeling a strange clarity then, a moment of sharp light inside the fog of anger and hurt. The audacity stunned me. To plan my weakening, my silence, my loss of agency, as if I were an object to be rearranged. There was something more chilling than the theft itself. It was the way they had rehearsed their story in advance, how they anticipated the legal defenses and intended to use my age as their shield. They spoke of risk and cover, of signatures and affidavits, as if they were arranging furniture in a room they intended to inherit. I did not confront them. The cameras had given me more than proof. They had given me time and a clearer sense of the moves to come. Rage flared and settled into a cold patience. I decided that open fury would only speed their hand. If Laura wanted to believe I was fragile, let her. If Mark thought he could turn documents and doctors into his allies, let him test that theory. I would let them proceed as if they had the upper hand, while I prepared in my quieter ways. There would be witnesses to call, lawyers to consult, and the careful collection of records that would show intent. I would record, I would watch, and I would not be surprised by what they thought would catch me unawares. Their plan to drug and to fabricate would meet with proof and with consequences. In the space between their plotting and their action, I found a resolve that felt steady and sharp. I would not simply be a passive signature. I would make sure my life and what I had saved would not be taken in darkness. I learned quickly that caution had to be my shield. When Natalie came to the hospital with food or drinks, her sweet face full of innocence, I never let her know that I hesitated. I would smile, thank her, and set the meal aside as if I were saving it for later. In truth, I never touched a single bite. Something inside me, sharpened by years of surviving life's storms, warned me that danger could hide in the smallest detail. Quietly, I began a routine. Whenever food arrived, I would slip it into a bag and later ask a trusted nurse or a doctor I had known for years to help me. Without raising suspicion, they arranged for the samples to be sent to an independent laboratory. It was a small act, discreet but necessary, because trust, once broken, leaves a mark that cannot be ignored. The results came back clearer than I ever wanted them to be. More than once, the tests revealed the presence of strong sedatives hidden inside the meals. These were not ordinary sleeping pills. They were the kind that cloud memory, weaken judgment, and blur awareness. If I had eaten them, I might have seemed confused, incapable, even incompetent in the eyes of others. It was a chilling thought to realize someone hoped to turn me into a shadow of myself. I held those reports in trembling hands, feeling both vindicated and terrified. Each page was stamped, signed, and official. In the United States, such medical evidence carries undeniable weight. It spoke not just of negligence, but of elder abuse, the cruel act of preying upon the vulnerable. And beyond that, it uncovered a darker intention, the calculated effort to strip me of the property and independence I had worked for all my life. At night, lying in the quiet ward, I stared at the ceiling and let the truth sink in. They wanted me weakened, disoriented, easy to manipulate. They wanted to turn my age into a weapon against me, to cloak their theft in the guise of legality. Yet in their arrogance, they forgot that wisdom sharpens with years. I was not helpless, and I would not go quietly. The laboratory reports became my armor. I stored them safely, knowing that one day they could speak louder than my voice. In a court of law, papers like these could cut through lies, exposing what words alone might fail to prove. And so, I kept waiting, patient and silent, while the net of evidence grew tighter around those who thought they could erase me. When Laura finally began showing her face at the hospital, I welcomed her with the weakest smile I could manage. I let my eyes drift as if they could not find their focus. I answered her questions with vague nods or murmured words that made little sense. Sometimes I would let my hands tremble, or whisper a phrase out of place, as if confusion had already swallowed me whole. It was not easy to play the role of a fading mind. Every part of me wanted to stand tall and confront her, but I knew better. The best defense was to let her believe the mask I wore. Her reaction was everything I expected. At first, she pretended to pity me, to fuss with my blanket and offer water. But soon her patience thinned, and in its place grew something sharp and dangerous. She no longer cared to hide the glint in her eyes. When she thought the nurses were out of earshot, she let arrogance slip into her tone. She spoke as though I were already absent, as if my presence in the room was no more than a shadow that could not resist. I watched her closely, though she thought I was too far gone to notice. On one afternoon, her phone lit up with Mark's name, and she answered without hesitation right there in my presence. Her voice dropped, but not enough to keep me from hearing. She promised him that only a few weeks remained. A few weeks, she said, until everything would be settled, until the house and the accounts would be theirs to claim. She spoke as if my life and my memories were simply paperwork to be signed away. It should have crushed me, hearing her treachery so openly. Yet instead, I felt a grim satisfaction. My act was working. The more vacant I appeared, the bolder she became. She was weaving her own rope, pulling it tighter with each careless word. I let her believe her triumph was near. I let her think the medicine was doing its work, that her schemes were slipping past me unnoticed. And each time she smirked, each time she straightened her shoulders with pride, I grew more certain. The trap was setting itself. My feigned confusion was not weakness, it was a net, and when the moment came, it would close around her, leaving no escape. I knew that if I wanted justice, I would need more than suspicion and whispers. I would need evidence that no one could deny. That was why I hired a licensed private investigator, a step completely legal in America, and one that gave me the reassurance I was moving carefully. The man I chose had years of experience and a reputation for being discreet. He promised to follow Laura without being noticed, to document everything thoroughly. Weeks later, he came back with photographs that made my stomach twist. There was Laura, not once but several times, entering hotels with Mark. In some pictures they held hands. In others, Mark's arm wrapped around her waist while she laughed openly, her smile the kind I had never seen when she was with my family. These were not business meetings. They were moments of intimacy captured in daylight, evidence that spoke louder than any denial. But the investigator did not stop there. He dug deeper, tracing purchases Laura thought no one would ever connect to her. He found receipts from a pharmacy, signed under her name, for strong sedatives, the very kind that had shown up in the independent lab tests of the food she sent to the hospital. Page after page, the invoices revealed a pattern. This was not coincidence, it was deliberate. When he laid everything out before me, the photos, the medical reports, the pharmacy bills, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. Anger because the betrayal was now written in black and white, undeniable. Relief because with every page my case grew stronger. It was no longer my word against hers. It was documented fact, the kind that courts respect, the kind that no smooth talk or false tears could erase. I took no chances with what I now held in my hands. Every file, every photograph, every receipt was carefully organized. I kept one set locked away in my home, hidden where no one could stumble upon it. Another copy was scanned and stored in a secure electronic account, protected by a password only I knew. Technology, which so many in my generation feared, became my ally. With it, I ensured that even if Laura discovered one copy, the truth could never be destroyed. As I looked over the folder one last time, I realized that this was more than just evidence of adultery or theft. It was a shield I had built, step by step, to protect not only my home, but my dignity. Laura and Mark believed they were clever, but every careless step they took had been recorded. They had written the story of their own downfall, and I had simply preserved it. Through the weeks of quiet watching, the picture became clearer than I ever imagined. Mark was not simply Laura's secret lover. The detective's reports revealed something darker. He was drowning in debt, the kind of debt that makes people reckless. His plan was to use Laura as the bridge, to push me into a quick sale contract where my house would be flipped for fast cash. The home I had worked for, the place I had built with sacrifice, was nothing more than a pawn in his scheme to crawl out of his own ruin. Laura, blinded by her greed and the thrill of her affair, had no idea that every step she took was being shadowed. Every hotel visit, every receipt, every phone call left a trace, and the detective followed them all. She thought she was clever, weaving her lies tightly, but the net was already wrapped around her, thread by thread. She never knew that the more she plotted in secret, the more her secrets became mine to hold. To me, Laura was no longer just a selfish daughter-in-law who failed to show compassion. She had crossed into something far more dangerous. She was now a threat to my life, to my dignity, and to the assets that the law recognized as rightfully mine. A woman who schemes with a desperate man, who poisons meals, who forges papers, is no longer simply unkind. She is an enemy. And yet, I did not confront her. I did not storm into the room and expose what I knew. Rage would only feed her narrative, make me appear unstable. Instead, I kept my face calm, my voice steady, my presence weak enough to lull her into comfort. The storm in me remained hidden. I listened when she pretended to care. I nodded when she spoke of responsibilities. But in my mind, I was already moving the pieces of a greater plan. There would be a moment, I decided, a public moment where truth could not be twisted. A place where she and Mark would face their lies under the weight of undeniable proof. That would be my move, my great play. Until then, silence was my weapon, and patience my ally. That afternoon, the house was quieter than usual. Natalie came home from school earlier than expected, her sneakers hardly making a sound as she slipped through the front door. She meant only to drop her backpack and grab a snack, but as she passed the living room, she froze. Her mother was not alone. Sitting across from her was a man Natalie had never seen before. The air inside the room felt different, tense, secretive. On the coffee table lay a thick stack of papers, pages spread out as if they were in the middle of something urgent. Her mother's pen moved quickly, her brows drawn together, her lips tight in concentration. The man leaned in, pointing to different lines on the documents, his voice low but firm. Natalie could not hear every word, but she caught the rhythm of serious business. He was clearly not a family friend. His sharp suit, polished shoes, and the heavy leather briefcase at his side made him look like the businessmen Natalie sometimes saw in office buildings downtown. He did not belong in their cozy living room. The way he studied her mother, the way he pressed his finger against the paper, made it all feel wrong, as if something dangerous was unfolding right before her eyes. Natalie's heart began to race. She instinctively stepped back, holding her breath so she wouldn't be noticed. The scene was so far from the ordinary warmth of home that she felt like she had stumbled into someone else's life. Her mother's face was stern, even cold, nothing like the one she wore at family dinners. And the way she signed her name, one page after another, sent a chill down Natalie's spine. A dozen questions swirled inside her, but she dared not speak. Who was this man? Why was her mother meeting him in secret? What were those papers that looked so official? She felt too small to ask, too afraid to interrupt. She clutched her backpack strap, pressed herself against the hallway wall, and watched silently. Finally, When the man gathered the papers into his briefcase and her mother leaned back with a sigh, Natalie slipped away. She tiptoed down the hall, her thoughts pounding louder than her footsteps. She did not yet understand the full weight of what she had seen, but suspicion had already taken root. Something was happening behind closed doors, something that could not possibly be good. Natalie kept the secret to herself that night, but the image of her mother and the stranger lingered in her mind, and though she did not know it yet, she had just witnessed the first crack in a truth that would soon shatter everything. When I asked the detective to look deeper, he wasted no time. Within days, he returned with a name that confirmed my worst suspicions. The man sitting in my living room with Laura was Mark, a licensed real estate broker. On the surface, his profession gave him credibility, but the file the detective placed in front of me revealed a very different picture. Mark had a history. The report detailed how he had been involved in several questionable house flip operations, schemes that targeted the elderly. His method was disturbingly consistent. He would gain their trust, present stacks of paperwork disguised as harmless, and then push them into signing away ownership. By the time his victims realized what had happened, the properties were gone, sold off quickly, with profits pocketed by Mark and his partners. Some families had tried to fight back, but the legal process was slow, and many cases faded into silence. The detective's evidence was solid: documents, testimonies, even past complaints from other victims. It painted a man who knew the loopholes of the system and had no hesitation exploiting them. And now, with Laura by his side, he had found a way into my family. What made it worse was the detail that Laura and Mark were not just lovers. They were working together, aligning their personal betrayal with a financial crime. The detective explained that they were in the process of fabricating paperwork, forging my signature and altering forms to make my house look like a legitimate listing. Once it appeared as a legal sale, nothing would stop them from transferring ownership and collecting the money. As he spoke, my hands trembled slightly, though I forced myself to sit still. This was no longer about petty greed or hidden infidelity. This was a crime with a name: real estate fraud. In the United States, that carries serious weight. It is not a misunderstanding, not a family quarrel. It is a felony, one that could lead to indictments and prison sentences. I sat in silence, the air heavy around me. Laura had not only betrayed the trust of her family, she had tied herself to a man whose entire life was built on deceiving the vulnerable. Together they believed they had crafted a plan too clean to be caught. But what they did not realize was that every step had been followed, every thread documented. The law, which they thought they could bend, was already turning against them. The detective's next visit brought with it a folder that felt heavier than paper should. He laid the documents on the table, his voice steady but edged with anger. Inside were copies of contracts that Mark had drafted, and at the bottom of those pages sat my name, my own signature, or so it appeared. At first glance it looked real, but the detective pointed out the truth. The signature had been scanned from old records and printed onto new documents. It was nothing but a forgery, a false version of myself being used as a weapon against me. The plan was chilling in its simplicity. Laura and Mark were counting on my supposed frailty. If they could convince people that I was forgetful, that I rambled and couldn't recall the day, then the forged papers would slip through without suspicion. They would argue that I had willingly signed, and with my so-called memory loss, I would have no way to dispute it. Once the real estate company processed the forms, the house would no longer belong to me. It would be listed, marketed, and sold, bringing them hundreds of thousands of dollars while I was left with nothing. I imagined strangers walking through my home, Laura handing over the keys with a smile, Mark shaking hands as though he had accomplished something legal. The thought made my stomach tighten, not only because of the theft, but because of the cruelty. They were not just taking walls and bricks, they were stealing the years of sacrifice, the quiet pride I had poured into that house. But what Laura and Mark did not know was that I had already built a shield. Every suspicious meal, every drink I received in the hospital had been tested and logged. The lab results showed traces of sedatives strong enough to blur memory and dull the mind. Those reports, signed and stamped, were evidence of elder abuse. Paired with the detective's discovery of the forged signature, the case against them was no longer a private suspicion, but a legal reality. I said nothing when the detective slid the evidence toward me. Instead, I placed my hand on the folder and let a calm settle over me. Rage was useless now. What I needed was patience. Let Laura continue to believe I was slipping. Let Mark think his paperwork was flawless. The more confident they grew, the easier it would be to catch them in their own trap. They had tried to erase me with ink and lies. They had planned to strip me of my home under the cover of legality. But while they plotted in secret, I had quietly gathered the truth. And when the time came, it would not be me who stood defenseless. It would be them. The detective did not just bring me forged papers and dry reports. He came back with something far more cutting: photographs. Spread across the table were glossy prints that spoke louder than any testimony could. In one after another, Laura appeared beside Mark, stepping into the glass doors of hotels, their bodies close enough to leave no doubt. These were not chance meetings or innocent conversations. They were images of intimacy, repeated over time, proof that this was not a single mistake but a pattern. The photographs told a story in sequence. One showed them walking side by side through a luxury mall, her arms filled with branded bags, his hand brushing her back as though guiding her. Another caught them seated at a candlelit restaurant, heads bent together, their laughter frozen mid-frame. Laura's smile was wide, her expression carefree, a side of her I had never seen when she was with our family. There was joy there, but it was joy built on betrayal. To look at those pictures while remembering my own time in the hospital was almost unbearable. I thought of the sterile walls, the lonely nights when I wondered why she never came to visit, why she claimed she was too busy or too tired. Now I knew the truth. While I lay in weakness, she was laughing in silk dresses, raising wine glasses, and spending stolen evenings with a man who was not her husband. The bitterness of it was sharper than any medicine I had ever swallowed. This was not just disloyalty to her marriage, it was a reflection of her character, a window into the greed that had already led her into schemes against me. For if she could betray her husband so openly, how difficult would it be for her to betray the woman she only called mother when it suited her? The detective leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. These images, he explained, did more than reveal infidelity. They connected motive to action. They showed Laura's tie to Mark as not only personal but strategic. Together, they were building a partnership that fused passion with conspiracy. The affair was not separate from the fraud, it was the very fuel behind it. I sat with the photos spread before me, my fingers brushing lightly against their edges. Each smile, each careless gesture, each evening out became another stone in the case I was building. Laura thought she was hiding in plain sight, but she had already exposed herself. What she believed were private moments of triumph were, in fact, her own confession, captured forever in the cold, unblinking eye of the camera. The day I spread all the evidence across my table, I realized the game had already shifted. The forged contracts, stamped with my stolen signature, lay side by side with the glossy photographs of Laura and Mark parading their affair in public. Separately, they were damning enough. Together they formed a chain Laura could never break. She had bound herself not just to betrayal, but to crimes that carried weight under the law. This was no longer the kind of story families whisper about behind closed doors. It had stepped into the territory of legal charges, real estate fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy. The kind of accusations that draw judges, lawyers, and prosecutors, not just gossiping neighbors. Every document she touched, every careless smile in those photos, had built the case against her. And then there was Natalie, my sweet granddaughter, who had seen what no one else had. She had stumbled into the living room one afternoon and found her mother sitting with Mark, papers spread across the table, her pen moving quickly over the lines. Natalie had been too frightened to speak, but she carried the image with her, and later her whispered confession became a truth no court could dismiss. Out of innocence, she had become a witness. That was the twist Laura never saw coming. She thought she was clever, that her lies were airtight, that my age made me easy to manipulate. She thought no one could see the shadows she lived in, but she forgot the eyes of a child are sharper than any camera, and the quiet patience of an old woman is stronger than her greed. From that moment on, the balance of power tilted. Laura still walked the house with her air of triumph, speaking softly into her phone, believing victory was near. But I no longer felt cornered. The evidence was mine, safe and solid. The truth was no longer fragile, it was iron. Laura imagined she was tightening her grip on me, but in truth, every step she took was pulling her deeper into the trap she had built herself. I sat in silence, letting her think she was winning. In my heart, I knew the end had already been written. When the time came, it would not be my word against hers. It would be the law against her greed, the truth against her lies. And that was a battle she could never win. I spent many sleepless nights arranging the evidence, making sure each piece was placed in order, so there would be no room for denial. On the table before me lay photographs of Laura with Mark, stepping into hotels as if they were a married couple. Alongside them were video clips taken discreetly by the detective, catching their intimate gestures in places they thought were hidden. Then came the receipts from the pharmacy, showing her purchases of strong sedatives, and the laboratory results that confirmed the same substances in the food I had been given. Every page told a story of betrayal, and together they formed an undeniable truth. When the file was finally complete, I scanned it into a secure folder, one that required a password only I knew. With trembling hands but a steady heart, I drafted an email to my son. I attached the folder and wrote only one line. Con hai nin bang mat min, truok ki kwamun. It was not my place to scream, nor to beg. The truth was enough, and he had to face it on his own. Christopher's reply did not come quickly. Hours passed, then a full day, and still silence. I imagined him sitting in front of his computer, staring at the images, the receipts, the reports, refusing to believe. He had always wanted to see his wife as loyal, trustworthy, the woman who shared his life and his future. To accept what I had sent was to accept that the foundation of his marriage was built on lies. When at last he called me, his voice was strained, almost broken. He said he did not know what to believe. He admitted that part of him wanted to throw the evidence away, to cling to the woman he thought he knew. But another part of him, the part shaped by reason and love for his family, could not ignore what his own eyes had seen. The conflict tore through him. He wanted to protect his wife, yet the betrayal was painted across every page. He wanted to doubt me, yet my words had never been anything but honest. Between mother and wife, between loyalty and truth, he stood in the cruelest of crossroads. I listened without pressing, letting his silence stretch, letting his heart wrestle with the unbearable. This was not only my battle anymore, it was his as well, and the choice he made would shape everything to come. Christopher sat in front of his laptop, the room silent except for the faint hum of the screen. At first he clicked through the file quickly, almost dismissively, as if rushing would somehow lessen the weight of what he was about to see. But then he reached the video clip. There was Laura, his wife, walking into a hotel lobby, her hand laced tightly with marks. She was laughing, her smile radiant, a smile he hadn't seen directed at him in years. His whole body went rigid. For a long moment he simply stared, waiting for an explanation that never came. There was no mistaking what he saw. He clicked again, almost with shaking hands, and the next set of images appeared. Documents stamped with official seals, contracts with his mother's name at the bottom. At first he wanted to believe they were legitimate, that maybe his mother had misunderstood. But then he saw it. The signature, neat and precise, a replica of her writing. It was a scan, a false copy placed onto papers that were meant to strip his mother of her home. Christopher's chest tightened. This was no longer a matter of jealousy or suspicion. This was crime, clear and deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, pressing both hands against his face. Anger burned through him, but beneath it was shame, heavy and sharp. His voice broke into the quiet room. "Me noi dung, Conda devo bien que hui huai jadin. The words tasted bitter because they admitted more than betrayal. They admitted failure. He had been blind, too willing to believe Laura's excuses, too eager to dismiss his mother's warnings as exaggerations. The anger turned inward for a moment, but quickly it flared outward again. Laura hadn't just betrayed him as a husband. She had endangered his mother, the woman who had raised him, protected him, given him everything. He felt as if the floor beneath him had shifted, and now there was only one side he could stand on. When he finally called his mother, his tone was different. The hesitation, the doubt, the defensiveness, they were gone. In their place was a hard resolve. He admitted she had been right, and for the first time, he asked what they should do next. It was not just her fight anymore. It was his as well. Together they would plan. Together they would strike back. Laura had no idea she was walking straight into the net I had cast. My act of forgetfulness had fooled her so completely that she now spoke of me as if I were already gone. She told her friends on the phone that I couldn't manage my affairs anymore, that it was only a matter of time before doctors confirmed I had lost my mind. With that confidence, she began moving her belongings into my house, dragging suitcases across the floor like a conqueror claiming new territory. Soon, she announced to Christopher that she would treat the place as her official residence. She strutted through the halls as if the home I had built, the rooms where every corner held memories, had somehow become hers by right. I sat quietly, my face blank, playing my part, while inside me the rage simmered. The transformation began almost immediately. She hired delivery trucks, hauled in new furniture, and had workers carry out my things as though they were junk. The carved oak chairs my late husband had chosen, the old grandfather clock that had marked birthdays and anniversaries, the shelves of books I had loved for years, gone within days. In their place appeared velvet couches that smelled of chemicals, cheap chandeliers that glittered harshly, and tacky decorations bought to impress rather than to comfort. I watched her strut through the living room in high heels, smiling at the changes she called fresh and modern. To her, the gaudy shine was luxury. To me, it was theft dressed in glitter. Each piece she discarded was not just furniture, it was a part of my life, a piece of my heart. She could not see that what she was stripping away was not wood or fabric, but the history of a family. There were moments I wanted to scream, to stand and tear the fake smile from her face, but I held my silence. I reminded myself that anger would only betray my secret. She believed I was slipping into confusion, believed I could not even see the destruction happening around me, and that belief was my weapon. Inside, though, I made a vow. Watching her walk through what she thought was her victory, I promised myself this would not last. The more she reveled in her false triumph, the sharper my determination became. She thought she was taking over a house. In truth, she was writing the final chapter of her own downfall. I knew that silence alone would not save me. If Laura wanted to play her game in the open, then I needed to prepare mine in the shadows. I called my personal attorney, a man who had guided me through past financial decisions with sharpness and integrity. When we met, I handed him a folder stacked with photographs, receipts, lab reports, and the investigator's findings. I explained everything: the forged signatures, the sedatives hidden in my meals, the hotel visits, the plans to sell my home as if it no longer belonged to me. He studied the evidence carefully, nodding as he flipped each page. His expression was grave but steady. Finally, he looked up and spoke in the calm voice that had carried me through other storms. "You already have enough to build a strong case for real estate fraud and elder abuse, but my advice is patience. Let them keep digging their own hole. The law favors clarity, and the more mistakes they make, the easier it will be to hold them accountable." I listened, breathing deeply as his words settled into me. Patience had never been my strongest virtue, but in this battle, it was my shield. I returned home with a new resolve. If Laura thought she had already won, then every arrogant step she took would become another stone in the wall closing around her. From that day forward, I began recording everything. When new furniture arrived, I kept the delivery receipts. When utility bills came addressed in Laura's name, I photographed them and stored copies in my secure file. Every change she made to the house, every lamp, every contract, every bill, was evidence that she was acting as if she were the rightful owner. She had not earned that title, she had stolen it. At night, as the house grew quiet, I walked from room to room, memorizing the difference between what was mine and what she had forced into place. Each detail I logged, not out of obsession, but out of discipline. My attorney's words guided me like a steady hand on my shoulder. The trap was not only emotional, it was legal, and soon the law would be my weapon. I told Christopher that silence was our greatest weapon. No anger, no accusations, no sudden moves. He had to act as though he knew nothing, as though he was still the same trusting husband he had always been. It was not easy for him. His voice cracked when he promised me he would try, but he understood that patience now meant justice later. When he returned home, he forced himself to smile at Laura, to sit at the dinner table and listen to her chatter as if nothing had changed. Yet inside him, a storm raged. Every glance at her face, every careless word she spoke, reminded him of the betrayal seared into his heart. He laughed at her jokes. He asked about her day, but beneath the calm exterior was a knot of fury and shame. Laura, blinded by her own arrogance, grew bolder each day. Believing her act of control was complete, she no longer cared to hide her intentions. On the phone with friends, she boasted that she would soon have a house in her own name, a gift from a mother-in-law who was too weak to stop her. Christopher overheard more than once, each time biting his tongue until his jaw ached. The words cut him deeply, but he remembered my warning. Patience. Always patience. Meanwhile, I watched from a distance, gathering the threads tighter with every passing day. Each careless boast, each arrogant step, only strengthened the case I was building. Laura believed she was moments away from victory, but she had no idea that she was walking straight into the trap. I had no interest in striking too soon. The power of truth lies in timing. So I waited, calm and deliberate. The evidence was already in my hands: the forged papers, the pharmacy receipts, the photographs of her affair. But I wanted more. I wanted a moment that could not be denied, a scene so clear that even Laura herself would be left without words. A moment where her lies would collapse under the weight of their own shamelessness. In the quiet of my room, I whispered to myself the plan again and again. We would wait, we would watch, and then, when the time was right, when Laura and Mark believed themselves untouchable, we would strike. Not with anger, but with proof. Not with noise, but with precision. And when that moment came, it would not just be a confrontation, it would be the end game. Laura's downfall began with a lie she thought was clever. One Friday evening, she told Christopher she had to leave for the weekend. Her voice carried that polished calm she used when she wanted to sound professional. She explained that she was assisting a major client and would be away for a couple of days. On the surface, it was believable. Work trips were not unusual for her. She kissed him lightly on the cheek, packed a small suitcase, and walked out of the house with the air of a woman who had everything under control. But Christopher no longer lived in the fog of blind trust. He nodded, pretended to accept her words, but the moment she left, he picked up his phone. His call to the private investigator was short and direct. He wanted to know exactly where Laura would be, and he wanted the truth without delay. The detective moved quickly, and within hours he sent back a message that made Christopher's stomach tighten. Laura had not gone to any business trip. She and Mark had checked into a luxury hotel downtown, their names hidden under false registrations. The news traveled straight to me. My heart raced, not with shock, but with the sharp edge of readiness. This was the moment we had been waiting for, the open window to catch her with no room to deny. All the weeks of silence, all the patience, all the evidence we had gathered were leading to this night. Christopher and I met quietly, speaking in hushed tones so no one else could overhear. He looked pale but resolute, his jaw set like stone. "We end this now," he said, his voice low, steady, and I agreed. It was not enough to have photographs or receipts hidden in folders. The truth needed to be pulled into the light, where she could not wriggle free with excuses or lies. Together, we made a plan. We would go to the hotel, not as victims, but as witnesses ready to expose the betrayal. The detective had already secured the room number. Everything was set. I could almost feel the weight of justice settling on my shoulders. This was not revenge driven by anger. This was the moment of reckoning where the mask would finally shatter. As we prepared to leave, I looked at Christopher. He carried pain in his eyes, the pain of a man betrayed by the woman he once trusted with his life. But behind that pain was determination. He was no longer torn between his mother and his wife. He had chosen truth, and truth would be our weapon that night. That night, the car ride to the hotel felt longer than any journey I had taken in years. Christopher drove in silence, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles were pale. Beside him sat a young assistant from our lawyer's office, a steady presence meant to serve as both witness and shield. In my lap I held a small handheld camera, its red light waiting to blink alive. None of us spoke much. The air was thick with anticipation, every mile drawing us closer to the truth we could no longer avoid. When we arrived, we moved with quiet precision. The detective had already confirmed the room number. We walked down the hallway of the luxury hotel, the carpet muffling our steps, until we stood before the door. My heart pounded, but my face remained calm. Christopher looked at me, his jaw set, and I nodded. It was time. We had rehearsed it carefully. A knock, polite but firm, just like hotel staff delivering a tray or a bottle of wine. Christopher raised his hand and tapped. For a moment there was silence inside, then footsteps shuffled. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. The scene that spilled out was one I will never forget. Laura stood in a silk nightdress, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face flushed in surprise. Behind her, Mark was still half-dressed, his shirt hanging open, the bed rumpled and unmistakable. The camera in my hands blinked red, recording every detail. The assistant beside us scribbled notes, his presence making the moment official, undeniable. For Laura, the shock was instant. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, but no words came. She froze like a child caught stealing, unable to mask her guilt. For Christopher, the pain was sharper than any blade. His face drained of color as he took in the sight of his wife exposed, not by rumors, not by suspicion, but by the naked truth before him. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than any accusation. In that silent corridor with the door wide open and the night air drifting in, Laura's lies crumbled. What she thought she controlled was now shattered, captured forever on film and witnessed by the law. This was the moment we had waited for, the strike of lightning that split the darkness. And as Laura stood trembling in her nightdress, she must have known. The empire of deceit she had built was beginning to collapse. Laura's mask shattered in an instant. The moment the camera light blinked red, she gasped and stumbled backward, clawing at the sheets as if the thin fabric could hide her shame. Her voice trembled, broken into fragments of excuses that never formed into sentences. She tried to summon the confidence she once wore like armor, but all that emerged was panic. Mark reacted faster. He grabbed his jacket from the chair, shoved his arms through the sleeves, and darted past us without a word. His footsteps echoed down the hallway as he fled, leaving Laura alone in the wreckage of their betrayal. The slam of the stairwell door in the distance marked his cowardice louder than anything he could have said. The camera stayed steady, capturing every detail. Christopher's hand did not shake as he held the lens on her. I could see the rage and heartbreak in his eyes, but his voice remained firm. "No more lies," he said quietly, though the weight of those words struck harder than any shout could have. The detective's equipment recorded everything: the disheveled bed, the nightdress clutched desperately to her chest, the guilty silence pressing down on the room. Laura looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Gone was the arrogance, the smug tilt of her chin, the sharpness of her words. In its place was a woman cornered, humiliated, unable to piece together the mask she had lived behind for so long. She shook her head, muttering incoherently, as if denial might erase what had already been caught on film. I stood there watching. not with triumph, but with a cold certainty. This was the moment we had prepared for. The proof beyond question, the unveiling of a truth she could never bury again. Every boast, every arrogant claim she had made about owning what was mine had crumbled into the cheap carpet beneath her feet. And though her lips still tried to form excuses, the silence between us made it clear. There was nothing left to say. Christopher's face burned with fury, his breath sharp and uneven as if each second standing there drained the last of his restraint. His hands trembled, not with weakness but with rage that had been caged for far too long. Slowly, he reached into his briefcase, the silence of the room broken only by the sound of the zipper. When his hand emerged, it held a stack of papers folded neatly, waiting for this exact moment. He stepped forward and slammed the document down onto the edge of the rumpled hotel table. The sound cut through the air like a crack of thunder. Laura flinched, clutching the blanket closer to her chest. Christopher's voice, though shaking, carried an edge of finality. "This ends tonight." Each word dropped heavy and merciless, stripping away the last illusion of their marriage. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The weight of those words lingered, more powerful than any accusation. In that instant, the fragile facade of a home built on lies collapsed. What had once been called love now lay in shards at their feet, too sharp to ever be pieced together again. Laura's lips parted as though she wanted to protest, but the papers themselves silenced her. Divorce, already prepared, already signed on his end, spoke louder than her excuses. She reached for words, but they slipped away, leaving only the shallow sound of her breath. The arrogance she had worn like a crown was gone, replaced by fear and disbelief. Christopher turned then, his shoulders heaving, and looked at me. For the first time in years, his eyes were stripped bare of doubt. They carried pain, yes, but also clarity, the kind that comes only when illusions are torn away. His gaze held mine, steady and raw, and in it I saw the unspoken confession, "Mida dung tu dao." It was not triumph I felt, but a quiet sorrow. A marriage had ended, but what truly died was trust. Still, beneath the wreckage, there was a spark of redemption. My son had finally seen the truth for himself, and from that truth, we could begin again. I stood tall in that cramped hotel room, my voice steady though my heart pounded with years of pain. I opened the folder I had carried and laid each piece of evidence on the table, one after another. First came the photographs, Laura and Mark hand in hand, walking into hotels, dining together like lovers. Then the video, clear and undeniable, showing her slipping into his arms when she thought no one was watching. Finally, I pulled out the laboratory reports, pages stamped and signed, proving that the food I had been given was laced with powerful sedatives. The silence in the room grew heavy as the weight of truth filled it. Beside me, the young attorney we had brought along stepped forward. He adjusted his glasses, his tone formal but calm, the voice of the law itself. He confirmed aloud that everything captured on film and gathered in documents could be presented in court. These were not whispers, not rumors, not private suspicions. They were legal evidence, binding and irrefutable. He reminded Laura and everyone present that elder abuse and real estate fraud carried severe penalties, and no amount of denial could erase what had been recorded. Laura's body seemed to crumble. Her shoulders sagged, her hands clutched at the blanket as if it could shield her from the truth. Only hours ago she had walked through my home as if she owned it, boasting about her future house. Now she was stripped bare, exposed not just as an unfaithful wife, but as a manipulator, a fraud, a woman whose schemes had been caught in the act. Her arrogance evaporated, leaving only the trembling figure of someone cornered by the very justice she had mocked. Christopher stood to the side, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes cold and hard. He did not need to raise his voice. His silence spoke louder than any curse, the silence of a man who had seen enough and who would never look at his wife the same way again. The betrayal had ended here, not with arguments behind closed doors, but with the full weight of truth and law pressing down in public. For me, the moment was more than personal vindication. It was proof that justice could still prevail, not only within the fragile circle of family, but also under the authority of the law. What Laura had done was no longer a secret shame. It was a crime. And in that hotel room, in front of witnesses and cameras, she finally stood exposed. The climax had arrived, and with it, the certainty that her empire of lies had collapsed for good. The days that followed moved swiftly, not with the chaos of anger but with the precision of law. My attorney, calm and meticulous, gathered the final pieces of evidence into a single file thick with undeniable proof. On the morning we had agreed, he walked into the courthouse and filed the official complaint against Laura. The charges were clear and heavy: real estate fraud, elder abuse, and adultery as grounds for fault-based divorce. What once was hidden in shadows now stood in the open, written in the language of justice. The evidence spoke louder than any witness could. There were the laboratory results proving sedatives had been mixed into my meals, stamped and signed by independent specialists. There were the photographs and video clips of Laura with Mark, her hand in his, her lips curved into the same smile she had denied ever giving. And there were the forged real estate papers, my signature crudely copied, the documents that would have stripped me of my home if her plan had succeeded. Each piece was damning, but together they painted a picture too dark to ignore. The most serious, my lawyer explained, was the deliberate poisoning. In the eyes of the court, this was not only betrayal, but a threat to my life. It was evidence of intent, a dangerous act that could tip the case from civil fraud into the territory of criminal prosecution. Laura had not just reached for greed, she had placed my very existence at risk. As news of the filing spread through our community, whispers grew louder. Neighbors who once admired Laura's charm now turned away when her name was mentioned. People in town spoke in lowered voices at cafes and grocery stores, repeating fragments of the story: the affair, the drugs, the forged signature. Her reputation, which she had guarded so carefully, began to unravel before the trial even began. For me, it was not joy that filled those days, but a quiet steadiness. I did not relish her downfall. I only felt relief that truth was finally moving where it belonged, into the hands of justice. And though Laura still clung to her lies, I knew the tide had already turned. The case had been set in motion, and the law would take it further than any argument ever could. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was filled with people. Some came out of curiosity, others because the case had already spread across the community like wildfire. I sat quietly beside my attorney, my hands folded in my lap, while Christopher and Natalie sat a few rows behind me. The weight of the room pressed heavy, yet for the first time in months I felt a sense of calm. The truth was no longer hidden. It would now stand before everyone. When the prosecution presented the evidence, the silence in the courtroom deepened. The video played on the large screen, Laura and Mark entering the hotel room, their intimacy undeniable. Then came the forged real estate contracts, displayed page by page, the false signature a direct attack on my rights. The judge leaned forward, frowning, as each detail was explained. Laura's attorney tried to object, but every word collapsed under the mountain of proof. There was no defense strong enough to erase what the evidence showed. Laura sat pale and trembling. The arrogance she once carried had drained away. She tried to speak, but her words faltered, weak and unconvincing. The courtroom was no longer a place where charm or excuses could shield her. It was a place of law, and the law had no room for lies. Finally, the judge delivered the ruling. His voice was steady, firm, leaving no space for doubt. He declared that Laura was unfit to retain custody of Natalie, stating clearly that a mother who endangered her child's grandmother and conspired in fraud had forfeited her right to raise a daughter. Custody would remain with Christopher, with strict limits on Laura's contact. The words cut through the courtroom like a final verdict on her character. But the judgment did not stop there. The court recognized the seriousness of elder abuse, emphasizing that deliberate attempts to drug and defraud an elderly woman constituted a grave offense. The judge's words carried weight not just for Laura, but for everyone present. This was more than punishment for one woman, it was a warning, a declaration that the state would protect its elders and their property with the full force of law. As the gavel struck, a murmur spread through the room. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others nodded as if justice had been served. For me, there was no joy, only a deep release. The law had spoken, and Laura's downfall was complete, not in whispers, but in the open, where truth could no longer be denied. The trial ended, but the storm in Christopher's heart did not. That very week, he walked back into the courthouse, this time not as a son supporting his mother, but as a man ending a broken marriage. The divorce petition was filed swiftly, his decision sharp and final. There was no hesitation left in him. Laura's betrayal had cut too deep, her crimes too heavy to forgive. Alongside the divorce, Christopher submitted another request: legal guardianship over me, not as control, but as protection. He wanted the court to recognize what he now fully understood, that his mother had been the target of a cruel scheme, and that her rights needed strong legal safeguarding. More importantly, he asked that custody of Natalie be entrusted to me. He said it clearly to the judge: I want my daughter raised in a home where she will be safe, where truth and love are constant. The words carried weight not only in the courtroom, but in my heart. For years I had wondered if Christopher truly saw me, if he believed my quiet warnings or dismissed them as fear. But now, with his voice steady and his choices firm, I realized he had finally awakened. The promise he had made, "Me da dung tu dao," was no longer just words whispered in pain. It had become the turning point of our bond, the moment where mother and son stood together, stronger than betrayal. Natalie clung to me during those days, her small hands holding tightly onto mine as if afraid to let go. She had seen too much for a child, but in my arms, she found steadiness. Christopher visited often, but he wanted her to stay with me, in a home untouched by deceit. For Natalie, it was a second chance. For me, it was the beginning of healing. As for Laura, her world collapsed around her. Stripped of her marriage, abandoned by the daughter she once thought was bound to her, she found herself utterly alone. The arrogance she had worn so easily was replaced by silence and isolation. She had lost not only her home and her husband, but the one treasure she could never reclaim: her child's trust. There was no joy in watching her fall. It was simply the inevitable cost of her choices. What she had built on lies had crumbled, leaving only the truth standing firm. And though our family bore scars that would take time to heal, we also carried something Laura could never touch: the strength that comes from survival and from love that had weathered betrayal. Laura's downfall did not end in the courtroom. Once the judgment was made public, the community turned its back on her. Neighbors who once greeted her with polite smiles now crossed the street to avoid her. At the grocery store, whispers followed her every step, her name spoken in hushed tones laced with pity or contempt. What she had once guarded so fiercely, her image, was now shattered. She became a figure of scandal, her story splashed across the pages of local tabloids, twisted into headlines that left no room for dignity. The consequences spread beyond her personal life. At the company where she had built her career, the leadership could no longer ignore the storm. Her name had become toxic, tied to fraud and elder abuse. Clients began to question the firm's integrity, and soon the decision was inevitable. Laura was quietly asked to resign, though everyone knew it was dismissal in all but name. The position she once flaunted as proof of her success was gone, stripped away by the shadow of her own choices. Then came the financial ruin. The legal battle had not only cost her reputation, it had drained her savings. Court fees, attorney costs, and the damages she was ordered to pay to compensate for her schemes mounted higher than she could bear. With no steady income and no allies willing to help, Laura was forced to sell off what little she still owned: jewelry, luxury handbags, even the small condominium she had once considered her safety net. Everything went under the hammer. I heard from others how she sat in offices of brokers, signing papers with a blank stare, her hand trembling as she gave up piece after piece of the life she had built. From the outside, it might have seemed like justice, but for me, It was simply the natural consequence of greed. Laura had once set her sights on stealing my home, believing she could live in triumph. Yet now, the irony was cruel. She was left with nothing but debt, stripped not only of wealth, but of pride. Her story became a warning whispered in the community, a tale mothers told their daughters about what happens when ambition twists into deceit. She had tried to seize what was not hers, but in the end, everything she thought she owned slipped through her fingers. What remained was only the emptiness of disgrace. At last, the storm quieted. The court's ruling named me the legal guardian of Natalie, and she came to live with me in the house Laura had once schemed so desperately to steal. That home, scarred by betrayal, began to breathe again with laughter and warmth. Natalie's footsteps echoed through the hallways, and her soft voice reading books in the evenings became the music that healed my spirit. What Laura had tried to twist into her victory had turned into our sanctuary. The house itself told a story of restoration. I brought back the oak chairs that had once stood in the dining room, polished the grandfather clock until it gleamed, and returned the shelves of books that carried the fragrance of time. The velvet couches Laura had forced in were gone, replaced by familiar armchairs where I could sit with Natalie curled beside me. The living room once again reflected who we were, elegant, dignified, but most of all, bound by memory and meaning. It was no longer just a building of walls and windows. It was proof that dignity could endure even after deceit tried to erase it. Laura, in the end, vanished from our daily lives. No more sudden footsteps through the door, no more cold voice echoing down the hallway. What she left was a hollow absence, sharp at first, but slowly it became a kind of release. Her departure was both bitter and freeing. Without her presence, the air itself seemed lighter, and Natalie no longer flinched when evening came. There were nights when I sat in the garden, the twilight painting the sky in gold, and I let myself breathe without fear. The Yorkie rested at my feet, Natalie's laughter drifted from inside, and I finally felt the kind of peace I had thought was lost forever. It wasn't the peace of forgetting, it was the peace of surviving, of standing through the storm and still remaining whole. I know the community will go on telling Laura's story, shaking their heads at her fall. But in my heart, the real message is not about her ruin, it is about endurance. I smile gently when I think of it, and leave this one truth for Natalie, and for anyone who may listen. Greed will always consume itself. Justice may be slow, but it never fails. I sat quietly in the garden, the old wooden chair creaking softly beneath me, its familiar weight grounding me after so many storms. Beside me, Natalie sat cross-legged with her sketchbook, her pencil moving clumsily across the page as she tried to capture the roses blooming before her. Her brow furrowed in concentration, and then she glanced up at me with a smile, the kind of innocent, unguarded smile that carried more healing than any medicine. The air was touched with the fragrance of roses, their petals heavy with the warmth of late afternoon. Above us, the sky had begun to soften into shades of gold and crimson, the kind of sunset that paints everything in forgiveness. The light wrapped itself around the garden, turning the scars of the past into shadows that no longer hurt. Each ray seemed to whisper that the world still held beauty, even after betrayal. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening, not to raised voices, not to the clash of anger, but to the gentle scratch of Natalie's pencil, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the distant bark of the dog near the porch. It was silence, but not empty. It was the silence of peace, of a house no longer ruled by fear but by love. Looking at Natalie, I felt a surge of gratitude. She was only a child, yet she had carried truths that many adults would have hidden. Her courage had lit the path to justice, and her presence now was the purest reminder of why I had fought so hard. The home Laura tried to take was not just walls and bricks, it was this very moment, this sanctuary where love could grow again. The contrast was striking. Only weeks ago, these rooms had echoed with tension, with suspicion and deceit. Now, the same air was filled with warmth and quiet laughter. The transformation was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, like a flower opening at dawn. And as I sat there, I realized the peace I held now was more powerful than any victory. I did not know what tomorrow would bring. Perhaps challenges, perhaps whispers of the past. But as the sun lowered behind the trees and Natalie leaned her head gently against my arm, I understood that life did not need to be perfect to be whole. In this garden, in this moment, I had everything I needed. Natalie lifted her head from her sketchbook, her young eyes searching my face with a quiet intensity. "Grandma, are you really okay?" she asked, her voice soft, almost trembling with concern. For a moment I simply looked at her, this child who had seen too much but still carried a heart full of innocence. I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, letting my hand rest gently on her cheek. I smiled, not with triumph, but with the calmness that comes after a long storm. My eyes felt lighter, clearer than they had in years. "I'm okay, my dear," I said, my voice steady. "I've found justice. Justice isn't always in revenge. Sometimes it's in letting the greedy destroy themselves." Natalie blinked, absorbing the words slowly. Her pencil paused in midair. She tilted her head, as if turning the meaning around in her mind. I knew she was too young to grasp the full weight of what I was saying, but one day she would. And when that day came, she would understand why I had chosen patience over rage, why I had endured instead of striking blindly. That single sentence was not just for her. It was a truth I wanted every woman of my age to hear, every woman who had been underestimated, pushed aside, or preyed upon because of her years. We did not need to fight with fists or fury to reclaim our dignity. Sometimes we only needed to hold steady and watch as greed did the work for us, pulling the guilty down into the pit they had dug for others. I held Natalie's gaze until she smiled again, her face softening as if reassured. She lowered her head back to her notebook, sketching roses with renewed ease. Around us the garden glowed with the last rays of sunlight, each flower bathed in gold. The world seemed to exhale, carrying my words beyond the walls of our home. Yes, justice had come. Not through blood or cruelty, but through truth and endurance. And as Natalie's pencil scratched gently against the paper, I knew the lesson would live on in her heart, and perhaps in the hearts of all who heard our story. Natalie leaned her small head against my shoulder, the warmth of her touch more comforting than any victory I had ever known. In that quiet moment, I felt her breathing slow and steady, a rhythm that told me she felt safe, that she trusted me completely. It was not just the relief of a child seeking comfort. It was the unspoken bond between two souls who had walked through shadows together and come out into the light. I realized then that what I had reclaimed was not merely a house or even my dignity. I had reclaimed her future. The battles I had fought, the humiliation I had endured, and the patience I had held on to through endless nights of fear, all of it had led to this simple moment of closeness. Natalie would grow up not under the shadow of lies, but in the safety of truth. She would know that her grandmother had stood firm, and because of that, she too could stand strong one day. When I looked into her eyes, I no longer saw just a child. I saw a reflection of hope, of continuity, of everything that made life worth protecting. She gazed back at me with a light that washed away years of sorrow. To her, I was not a frail old woman. I was a figure of resilience, a protector, a symbol of wisdom she could lean on. The wrinkles on my face, once marks of age, seemed to her like lines of strength etched by survival. This recognition filled me with a joy deeper than triumph. What Laura had tried to take, my wealth, my home, my pride, seemed insignificant compared to what I had been given. Natalie's trust was the sweetest reward, far greater than any court ruling or financial restitution. It was proof that even after betrayal, love could bloom again, pure and untouchable. As the last rays of sunlight brushed the garden, Natalie slipped her hand into mine. We sat like that, still and content, two generations bound not just by blood but by faith in each other. I thought of all the storms behind us and knew the sweetest part of life was not revenge, nor even justice served. It was this bond, unbroken, unshaken, shining brighter than any treasure. I lifted my gaze toward the horizon, the glow of dusk spreading like a veil of quiet strength across the garden. My voice, though soft, carried a weight far beyond the moment, as if I were speaking not only to Natalie, but to every woman of my generation. Old age is not weakness, I said slowly, each word measured and steady. It is the weapon of wisdom. The years behind me had carved lines on my face, but they had also carved resilience into my spirit. What some saw as frailty, I now understood as power. Experience had sharpened my instincts, patience had taught me endurance, and dignity had become the shield that no betrayal could pierce. Age had not diminished me, it had armed me with the kind of strength no youth could fake. I wanted every mother, every grandmother listening to know this truth. Our value is not erased when the years pile up, nor is our voice silenced when we grow older. If anything, age gives us a clarity that cuts through deceit, a calmness that sees beyond false promises, and a pride that refuses to bow down. We are not easy prey for greed. We are, in fact, the guardians of family honor and memory. This story was never mine alone. It belonged to every woman who had once been betrayed by those she loved, every woman who had stood at the edge of despair and chosen to rise instead of fall. My struggles and my victories echoed theirs. By fighting for my home, for justice, and for Natalie's future, I had carried a torch that countless others had lit before me. I let the silence linger, as if to leave space for those invisible voices, the millions of women who might one day hear these words. Then I smiled, not for myself, but for all of us, and whispered the reminder I hoped they would carry. You have every right and every ability to protect your dignity, your property, and your happiness. Age is not the end, it is the proof of strength and the truest weapon of all. I took a deep breath, letting the calm of the garden steady me. My words were not only for Natalie, but for every soul listening, seen or unseen. If you too have lived through loss, betrayal, or injustice, share your story, because wisdom and dignity never grow old. The words fell into the still air like seeds, meant to take root in the hearts of those who heard them. This was not just a closing remark. It was a call, an invitation. Too many women carry their wounds in silence, hiding the scars of what they endured. But silence only deepens loneliness. By speaking, by sharing, we transform our pain into strength, and strength into connection. I wanted the audience not to remain distant observers, but to step closer, to become companions in this journey. When one woman tells her truth, another finds the courage to do the same. Stories spread like ripples on water, building a current strong enough to lift us all. In that moment, I believed with all my heart that each voice mattered. No betrayal, no injustice, no loss could erase the power of testimony. By sharing, we claim our dignity, we affirm that we are not defeated, and we remind one another that age is not weakness, but wisdom sharpened by time. I left the rest in their hands, to reflect, to speak, to connect. Justice is not only found in courts or verdicts, it is also born in the act of women standing together, refusing to be silenced.